Before we begin this powerful story, remember, your support keeps stories like these alive. So don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more breathtaking journeys into history, struggle, and hope. Now, let us take you into a tale of betrayal, sacrifice, and a miracle that shook the entire world. This is the story of how Ibrahim Traoré stunned the globe by saving 200,000 lives with free kidney dialysis. The story does not begin with speeches, nor with the thunder of parades. It begins in silence. In the basements of forgotten hospitals, in files yellowed by time and humidity, lay records no one wanted the world to see. They spoke of a creeping death spreading through the veins of Burkina Faso, kidney failure. Page after page told the same story. Lives cut short, families ruined, whole villages hollowed out. The numbers whispered of an epidemic, but the world had looked away. To them, Africa's suffering was not news. It was routine, and yet, inside these secret files, one fact was impossible to ignore. Without dialysis, thousands would die, slowly, painfully. Every nation has its silent catastrophes, but this one was different. It was not a famine announced on radio waves, nor a war broadcast on international screens. It was an invisible hunger of the body's own blood poisoned against itself. The machines that could save lives stood locked behind contracts written in foreign capitals, priced beyond imagination. Burkina Faso, a land already scarred by colonial debts and endless demands, had been told its place in the world, to export gold, to export cotton, but never to save its own people. And yet, in this quiet storm, a figure was watching, Ibrahim Traoré. For the world, he was already a symbol, a soldier turned leader, a man who had dared to defy the West. But for his people, he was something far simpler, a shield against despair. He read those hidden files. He listened to the weeping of mothers, and he understood the ultimatum that foreign corporations had set before him: pay their price, privatize his hospitals, surrender to their rules, or let his people die. It was meant to break him, but instead, it lit a fire. And what he did next stunned the globe. The story of this miracle begins years earlier, before the announcement that shook the world. In the dust of villages, where survival was a daily negotiation, Burkina Faso, a nation of resilience, carried wounds far older than its independence. Hunger walked hand in hand with poverty. Hospitals overflowed with patients and underflowed with medicine. For many, the cruelty of kidney disease came like a thief in the night. Farmers collapsed in their fields, unable to work. Children grew weak, their futures drained from them. Women walked miles, not for water this time, but for doctors who could do nothing but shake their heads. And when families scraped together enough money to send one patient for dialysis abroad, they often returned home carrying a coffin instead. The government was shackled. Every international loan came with strings. Every aid package hid conditions. The IMF dictated budgets with cold precision: more gold for export, less funding for healthcare. To foreign lenders, Burkina Faso's lives were statistics, nothing more. But Ibrahim Traoré was not built for submission. Born of soil and struggle, raised on the stories of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once dared to say Africa could feed itself, he knew that dignity was not gifted. It was taken back, piece by piece. And yet this health crisis was no ordinary battle. It was hidden, invisible, dangerous. Most leaders would ignore it, bury it under speeches about bigger issues. But Traoré saw something others missed. A people already near the breaking point. Hunger could be endured. Even war could be endured. But the slow, humiliating death of preventable disease, that was enough to turn hope into ashes. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. 3 men, powerful and well-connected, began plotting. They were not generals this time, but something worse, gatekeepers of medicine and money. One was a former minister tied to pharmaceutical giants in Europe. Another was a wealthy doctor who had grown rich by importing overpriced equipment. The third was a politician who thrived on foreign aid, his pockets lined with every loan Burkina Faso signed. Together they represented an empire of profit built on human suffering, and Ibrahim Traoré was about to threaten it. The stage was set like a thriller, a young leader staring down not armies this time, but contracts, black markets, and shadowy deals inked in hidden rooms. The price of resistance was clear. Refuse the corporations, and sanctions would bleed the nation dry. Accept their demands and his people would live only if they could pay. But between these two poisons lay something else. A possibility whispered to Traoré by quiet voices, a network of African doctors, scientists, and engineers who had been working in obscurity. They had ideas for cheap, innovative dialysis treatments, using local materials and knowledge. Their work was dismissed by the world as primitive, but to Traoré it was a spark, and sparks in the right hands can burn empires. Yet time was against him. Every week more lives slipped away. The numbers climbed higher, hundreds, then thousands. Funerals became as common as harvests. Mothers whispered prayers not for wealth, but for machines they could never afford. The IMF had already heard rumors of Traoré's plans. Pressure mounted. Sell your gold. Pay the price. Privatize your hospitals. Ultimatums came not in speeches but in the cold language of debt. But behind those demands, a darker shadow loomed. Men who would rather see Burkina Faso kneel than stand tall. As Act 1 closes, the air is thick with tension. A nation suffocating under disease, corporations circling like vultures, hidden allies waiting to be revealed, and Ibrahim Traoré, caught between betrayal and hope, preparing for a move that would either destroy him or change Africa forever. The whispers grew louder. Foreign corporations had caught wind of Traoré's defiance, and they did what they always did when an African leader threatened their control. They moved to crush him, not with guns but with contracts, sanctions, and silence. It began quietly, with the closing of supply chains. Orders for hospital equipment were mysteriously delayed. Spare parts for dialysis machines stopped arriving. Essential medicines, once overpriced but available, suddenly vanished from distribution lines. It was a slow suffocation, designed to make his people turn against him, and yet the world called it coincidence. Inside Burkina Faso, the suffering reached unbearable levels. Hospitals became cemeteries of despair. Families sold everything, cattle, land, even their homes, for just a handful of dialysis sessions. Children sat beside their fathers in waiting rooms, clutching prayer beads, watching monitors tick down the hours of a life that could not be saved. In the villages, women dug shallow graves for husbands and sons, whispering curses to a sky that seemed deaf to their pain. Everywhere he went, Traoré saw eyes filled not just with hunger, but with betrayal. His people had trusted him, and now they looked to him for answers he did not yet have. But in the shadows, hope stirred. One evening, in a dimly lit hall at the edge of Ouagadougou, Traoré met a group of men and women who had been waiting for this moment all their lives. They were doctors, engineers, and scientists, Africans who had been silenced by global institutions, their research dismissed as unreliable or unscientific. But what they showed Traoré was nothing short of revolutionary. Using local materials, they had developed prototypes of dialysis filters that could be produced at a fraction of the global cost. They had found ways to recycle and sterilize equipment safely. They had blueprints for solar-powered dialysis units, designed for rural hospitals where electricity was scarce. For years they had worked in secrecy, mocked and ignored. But now they laid their dreams before the young leader who might make them real. Traoré listened in silence, the weight of their words pressing against him like the burden of a nation. For the first time, he saw a crack in the prison walls built around his people. But if hope was stirring, so too was resistance. The three shadowy figures who profited from death, the minister, the doctor, the politician, tightened their grip. They met in private villas under the cover of night, conspiring with foreign agents. "If Traoré succeeds," they whispered, "our fortunes vanish. He must be stopped." They funneled money into networks designed to sabotage his plans. They spread rumors in villages that his dialysis project was a lie, a trick to distract from the real suffering. And they began bribing officials, seeding betrayal inside his own ranks. The IMF, too, sharpened its claws. Sanctions were announced, disguised as economic adjustments. Banks closed their doors to Burkina Faso. Neighboring countries pressured by quiet phone calls from Western capitals, began to distance themselves from Traoré. The message was clear. He could save his people or he could save his government, but not both. The pressure seeped into the hearts of his soldiers. Hungry and unpaid, some began to question whether their leader was dragging them into ruin. Ordinary citizens too began to waver. "Why fight a battle against the world?" they asked. Why not surrender and at least survive? But surrender was not in Traoré's nature. One night, standing before a room of weary ministers, he placed the scientists' blueprints on the table. "This," he said, voice steady, "is our weapon. Not rifles, not speeches. Machines that will save our people." His ministers stared in silence, fear etched into their faces. They saw not salvation, but war, the kind of war that does not explode in battlefields, but bleeds nations dry. Still, Traoré moved forward. Factories were repurposed. Engineers were recruited. Villages were told to hold on just a little longer. Hospitals began preparing rooms for machines that did not yet exist. It was a gamble so large that even his closest allies wondered if he had lost his mind. The conspirators struck back with fury. One prototype facility was set ablaze in the night. Another shipment of equipment vanished on the road, hijacked by men no one would name. In the capital, rumors spread of an assassination plot. Traoré knew he was being watched, hunted not with bullets yet, but with shadows. And still the people suffered. Mothers lined up outside clinics with children whose bodies swelled from untreated kidney failure. Farmers fell in the fields, carried back on carts pulled by oxen. The morgues overflowed. Each death was a question mark hanging over Traoré's gamble. How long could a people endure hope when death was at their doorstep? But then, a small miracle. In a rural hospital, far from the capital, the first locally built dialysis machine flickered to life. It was crude, imperfect, but it worked. The patient, a farmer who had collapsed days earlier, opened his eyes and whispered blessings to the doctors who surrounded him. Word spread like wildfire. Across villages and towns, people began to believe again. The impossible was happening, and yet the battle was only beginning. The corporations, the IMF, the conspirators, they had not yet revealed their full hand. Their networks of power were vast, their reach infinite. Traoré had challenged them not with armies but with machines of mercy. To the world this was unacceptable. To them, mercy was a currency to be sold, never given freely. And so, as Act 2 closes, Burkina Faso teeters on the edge. Its leader has chosen a path that could liberate or destroy. The conspirators sharpen their knives. The people hold their breath. And somewhere, in the depths of the night, Ibrahim Traoré prepares for the storm that is coming. The storm arrived not with thunder, but with silence. The silence of empty markets, where once lively trade had withered under sanctions. The silence of classrooms, where children sat listless, their parents too sick to send them. The silence of villages where kidney disease had stolen not just bodies, but futures. Burkina Faso was suffocating. The IMF had closed its iron fist. Banking systems locked the nation out. Foreign aid evaporated overnight. What little medicine trickled in came at prices higher than gold. Entire families now pooled their life savings to buy just one session of treatment, one chance at delaying the inevitable. It was despair by design. And in that despair, shadows moved. The three conspirators, the minister, the doctor, the politician, tightened their grip. They whispered to village chiefs that Traoré's machines were a trick, untested and dangerous. They spread stories that patients were dying on them, that the leader was experimenting with lives. They hired saboteurs to cut power lines to hospitals, to poison supply routes, to burn shipment depots. They wanted chaos. They wanted his people to turn against him. For weeks, Traoré barely slept. His days were consumed by crisis meetings, his nights by the sound of ambulances wailing through the capital. He carried the weight of 200,000 lives on his shoulders, and every new grave dug in red earth was a reminder of the clock ticking against him. Yet in the darkness, flickers of defiance glowed. Local engineers worked tirelessly. Building machines in warehouses guarded by soldiers. Doctors trained under flickering bulbs, learning to operate technology they had never touched before. Nurses whispered to patients, "Hold on. Your turn will come. One machine turned into 10. 10 turned into 50. Slowly the numbers grew. Not enough yet to save the nation, but enough to prove that hope was not a myth. But hope is dangerous. It was then that the conspirators made their boldest move. On a humid night in Ouagadougou, as patients gathered for the launch of a new dialysis center, an explosion ripped through the building. Walls collapsed. Machines were destroyed. Dozens died. The message was clear: stop, or more blood will flow. The nation trembled. Fear spread like wildfire. Was Traoré leading them into salvation or into ruin? For a moment, even his closest allies wavered. Ministers argued in hushed voices that he should negotiate, make peace with the corporations, bend just enough to survive. Soldiers muttered about defecting. Citizens whispered of betrayal, but Traoré did not bend. He stood before the rubble of the destroyed center, the smoke still rising into the night sky, and declared, "If they burn one machine, we will build 10 more. If they silence one patient, we will save 1,000 more." Burkina Faso will not surrender, his words spread like fire. For the first time in months, the silence broke. Villages cheered his name. Patients clung to hope. And the conspirators, watching from their palaces, felt the ground tremble beneath them. The corporations, furious at their failure to break him, unleashed a new weapon: global media. Newspapers across the world painted Traoré as reckless, a dictator sacrificing his people for pride. Anchors spoke of failed experiments, of dangerous improvisations. They called him a madman, a gambler. But something unexpected happened. Across Africa, people saw through the lies. They knew this pattern too well, how the world demonized anyone who dared to fight for dignity. In Ghana, in Mali, in Niger, in Congo, whispers grew into chants. If Burkina Faso can do it, why not us? The conspiracy had miscalculated. By trying to isolate Traoré, they had made him a symbol, and yet symbols are fragile. Assassination attempts followed. One night, gunfire echoed near the presidential residence. Another time, his convoy was ambushed on a rural road. Traoré survived, but the message was written in blood. His enemies would not stop until he was gone. Still, he pressed forward. Behind guarded doors, his engineers worked faster than ever. A breakthrough came. The solar-powered dialysis prototype functioned flawlessly, opening the possibility of treatment in villages far from the capital. Patients once condemned to die now returned home, alive, whispering tales of machines that gave them back their lives. It was then that the conspirators realized they were losing. The people were beginning to believe. So they unleashed their final card. Leaked documents, fabricated, but convincing, claimed that Traoré was secretly selling dialysis technology to foreign nations, profiting from his people's suffering. Panic swept the country. Opposition leaders demanded answers. Crowds gathered in the capital, torn between faith and fury. For the first time, Traoré stood at the edge of collapse. He could give in, accept the corporation's terms, and save his government. Or he could risk everything on one final gamble, a full public unveiling of the free dialysis revolution, exposing his enemies before the world. He chose the gamble. The stage was set. The machines were ready. The eyes of a nation, and soon the world, were fixed on him, and as the curtain of Act 3 falls, the air trembles with suspense. The conspirators sharpen their knives. The IMF holds its breath. Patients cling to hope. And Ibrahim Traoré, standing at the crossroads of history, prepares for the moment that will define not only his life, but the destiny of Africa itself. The morning of the unveiling began in silence. Ouagadougou's streets, usually alive with noise, were hushed, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Across the nation, radios crackled, televisions flickered, and people gathered in squares, clinics, and churches to hear the words of their leader. For weeks, rumors had swirled of sabotage, of betrayal, of miracles whispered in hidden corners. No one knew what was true anymore, but they knew one thing. Today, everything would be revealed. At the heart of the capital stood a new building, gleaming against the dusty skyline. It was not a palace nor a military fortress. It was a hospital. Its walls were simple, But inside were machines unlike anything Burkina Faso had ever seen. Rows upon rows of dialysis units, built not in foreign factories but by the hands of Burkinabe engineers. The world was watching. International journalists filled the press hall, their cameras ready to catch a failure. Corporations waited for proof that Traoré's defiance had been madness. His enemies, the minister, the doctor, the politician, stood in the shadows, confident that his gamble would collapse under the weight of reality. And then, Ibrahim Traoré walked to the podium. He was not dressed in regalia, but in the simple fatigues of a soldier. His voice carried the weight of a nation. For too long, our people have been told their lives are worth less than contracts, less than profits, less than gold. For too long, mothers have buried children, while corporations counted their money. Today we say no more. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the curtains behind him parted. Rows of patients lay connected to the new machines, their bodies weak but their eyes alive. Nurses moved between them, adjusting dials, monitoring screens. For the first time in history, hundreds of Burkinabe were receiving dialysis at no cost. The room erupted. Some wept, others cheered. Cameras flashed. The impossible was happening before their eyes. But not everyone celebrated. The conspirators struck. Midway through the broadcast, lights flickered. Screens went black. Alarms blared. Somewhere in the building, an explosion shook the walls. Panic surged as smoke filled the corridors. It was sabotage, the final desperate act of men who thrived on despair. For a moment, chaos threatened to unravel everything. Patients cried out, nurses scrambled, ministers shouted. Outside, crowds pushed against barricades, unsure if this was victory or massacre. And then, Traoré did something no one expected. He stepped away from the podium, into the chaos, and began helping carry patients himself. Cameras caught him lifting stretchers, shouting orders, guiding doctors. His hands were stained with the sweat and blood of his people, and in that moment, the world saw not a politician, but a man willing to risk his life for theirs. The saboteurs were caught. Soldiers dragged them into the open, their faces exposed to the cameras. The minister, the doctor, the politician. Betrayal laid bare before the nation. They had plotted in shadows, but now they stood disgraced in the light. The broadcast, briefly interrupted, returned stronger than ever. Across Africa, millions watched as Ibrahim Traoré stood over the wreckage of sabotage, declaring not defeat, but triumph. They tried to silence us with fire. But even fire cannot burn hope. Today, we do not just save patients. We save dignity. The climax had arrived, not just in one hospital, but across a continent. For in that moment, the machines did not represent only medicine. They were symbols of resistance, symbols that an African nation could defy the world and live. The IMF's ultimatums shattered. Corporations, humiliated, could only watch as their monopoly dissolved. The conspirators were dragged into custody, their power stripped away. And the people, once silent in despair, erupted into chants that rolled like thunder across the land. Traoré! 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 It was not merely the unveiling of a hospital. It was the unveiling of a revolution. As the smoke cleared and the patient stabilized, the world realized what had just happened. A small nation, one dismissed as powerless, had achieved what global powers said was impossible: free dialysis for 200,000 patients. The broadcast ended not with words, but with images. Mothers hugging children who had been given another chance. Fathers rising from beds to walk again, nurses weeping with joy, and at the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré, standing tall, not as a dictator nor as a soldier, but as a symbol of hope. The climax was complete. The world had been stunned, but history does not end in climaxes. It lingers in aftermaths, in the echoes that ripple across borders. And in those echoes, the true battle was just beginning. The smoke from the sabotage had barely cleared when the first headlines began to spread. Burkina Faso defies the world. Free dialysis launched. Traoré unveils miracle in Africa. Corporations humiliated as Burkina Faso saves its own. Within hours, the story circled the globe. Images of patients connected to locally built machines flashed across every screen. The sight of Ibrahim Traoré, sleeves rolled up, carrying patients through the chaos, became an icon. What was meant to be his downfall had become his greatest triumph. The conspirators, the minister, the doctor, the politician, were paraded before the courts. Their faces, once untouchable, now symbolized greed exposed. Ordinary citizens spat their names in contempt. They had thrived in shadows, but Traoré had dragged them into the light. Justice was swift, not only in the courts but in the hearts of the people. But the victory was not merely domestic. Its echoes reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Across Africa, leaders were shaken. For decades, they had been told what was possible and what was impossible. They had signed contracts that bled their nations dry, convinced there was no alternative. But now, a small, landlocked nation had shown the world that resistance was not just a dream. It was a reality. In Mali, students marched with placards reading, "If Burkina Faso can save lives, why not us?" In Niger, doctors demanded investment in local medicine. In Ghana, crowds chanted Traoré's name alongside their own heroes. A continent long taught to beg was suddenly daring to imagine. The corporations panicked. For years they had profited from monopolies on machines and medicines, confident that Africa would never break free. Now their empire trembled. Stock prices fell. Investors fled. Behind closed doors, executives screamed of betrayal, of a precedent that could not be allowed to spread. But it was too late. The IMF too staggered under humiliation. Their sanctions had failed. Their threats had collapsed. Instead of kneeling, Burkina Faso had risen. For the first time, their iron grip looked weak. Nations that once trembled at their conditions now began to question. If Burkina Faso could defy them, why not others? Inside Burkina Faso, the change was immediate, almost biblical. Hospitals once filled with silence now buzzed with life. Waiting rooms echoed with laughter as patients, once condemned, now received treatment without fear of cost. Families that had sold everything for one dialysis session now saw their loved ones return home, alive. Farmers returned to their fields. Children returned to school. Mothers wept tears of joy instead of despair. Numbers told the story. Tens of thousands saved in weeks, hundreds of thousands in months. A nation once defined by death was now defined by healing, but the transformation was not only physical, it was spiritual. For the first time in generations, the people of Burkina Faso felt dignity coursing through their veins. They were no longer spectators in their own survival. They were participants in a miracle they had built with their own hands. Engineers, doctors, nurses, even ordinary villagers had become part of something greater than themselves. And at the center stood Ibrahim Traoré. He was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a head of state. He had become something else, a symbol. A man who proved that leadership was not about speeches or parades, but about carrying the weight of the weakest on your shoulders. A man who showed that resistance was not only a political act, but a deeply human one. The world, once mocking him as reckless, now stared in silence. Nations in the West struggled to explain how a country they had dismissed as poor and powerless had achieved what their wealthiest hospitals often failed to do. Analysts debated, politicians stumbled, corporations denied. But the truth was undeniable. Burkina Faso had shaken the world. And yet Traoré himself did not claim glory. When asked by a journalist what this moment meant, he answered simply, "It means our people chose life. And life is not for sale." His words echoed far beyond the hospital walls. They became a rallying cry, etched into posters, painted on walls, whispered in prayers. Across Africa, they became a question, a haunting, liberating question. If one nation can break its chains, why not all? As the sun set over Ouagadougou, the city glowed not with streetlights, but with the energy of a people reborn. The chants of the crowds rolled through the night like thunder, carrying across borders, carried on winds that no power could stop. The story was not just about dialysis. It was about dignity, about defiance, about the moment a continent saw its reflection not in despair, but in hope. And in that hope lay the final unshakable truth. Burkina Faso had saved 200,000 lives. But in doing so, it had awakened millions more. And so the narration closes, not with a period, but with a question. Is this the moment Africa broke its chains?